Welcome to historic Riggs Library. It's my favorite space on campus. We're delighted we're here. No, you cannot climb up into the stacks, but it's just a lovely place to be. I thank you for coming out on a brisk Washington evening. And I thank the more than 1,000 people who have signed up for the live stream. One of the things about doing hybrid things is we have to start on time, which is a challenge for me, as my colleagues would tell you, because there's lots of people waiting. Speaking of time, this is timely. I mean, literally 10 days ago, we had an election. For those who are online, we hope you'll join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag FaithMidterms22 and by tagging GU Public Life. This roundtable is a continuation of our series on faith and the faithful in U.S. politics. And we're focusing on religious values and religious voters in the midterms. It's co-sponsored by the Georgetown Institute of Politics and Public Service. Eugene was a fellow a couple years ago. And with the support of our friends at the Democracy Fund. As we begin this Faith in the Faithful gathering, I want to recognize the sad news of the passing of Michael Gerson, who has been a regular, thoughtful, and generous participant in our dialogues. Many on the panel, many of you know Mike as a White House official, a speechwriter, an advocate for children, for people with HIV/AIDS, Washington Post columnist, an evangelical, a conservative, a Republican, who had the courage to challenge his church, his movement, and his party. He was a good friend for me and for the initiative, a principled leader, an eloquent writer, and a faithful Christian. All of us who knew Mike had our differences. And one of the things that was great about Mike is you could argue with him. And so the Iraq War was a source of division. I know a lot of my Republican friends thought he was way too tough on his party. But he did so as a matter of principle, as a matter of consistency, and with some civility. So we are diminished by his leaving, and we simply could not gather this evening without expressing our loss and gratitude for, frankly, the example he set of how faith does enrich public life. And I know a couple people on the panel knew and worked with Mike, and I'd invite you to say a word or two if you want. Eugene, you knew him at the Post?
I did. I knew him at the Post, and through his affiliation with the Faith Angle Forum, which a few of us are familiar with, which is a gathering of journalists who write about faith and how it intersects with everything in society. I spent quite a bit of time reading his old columns today, and one of the things I would encourage you to do that if you just Google Michael Gerson, Washington Post, the topics he touches on go so beyond public policy. I read this beautiful column today about parenting and him accepting that, parenthood is this ever-changing, experience shaped by the different chapters of kids' life. And it was fascinating to hear him put that in perspective. And also mental health and depression and so many just topics that we often do not see discussed in the context of faith and policy. He left us too soon, 58 years old. And I'm grateful for the time that I got to spend with him.
Yeah. Bill, you must have worked with Michael.
Boy, I sure did. I first met him when he was a young staff aide to Dan Coates, Senator Dan Coates. I was a member of the Clinton administration at the time, but we found a lot of common ground on children and family issues. And it was obvious, even from the first meeting, that this was a rare spirit. And I have reason to believe that when I left the White House, that he helped draft the remarks that Senator Coates, delivered on that occasion. And I have to say that I've admired his consistency, his courage, his clarity, in bearing witness to what he believed was the truth, even when it was painful and difficult for him to do so. I have a lot of friends in his nook of the conservative community who've lost friendships of a lifetime, just social bonds severed because they felt that they just couldn't go along with what they believed not to be true and good. So, along with everyone else, I mourn him.
He was a great friend of this initiative, and I encourage you to go online and take a look at some of the discussions he was a part of. I used to kid him that he was more Catholic than I was in a lot of ways, and he knew and was committed to Catholic social teaching in a way most Catholics were not. And he was a greater champion of Pope Francis in his leadership than many Catholics are. And for tonight's purpose, he was a great example of how religion and politics, which can explode and do damage, can also enrich and do good. So we remember Michael. So let's go to the topic that preoccupied Michael's writing and service. What's the role of the faith and the faithful in U.S. politics, particularly in these midterm elections? I've been in Washington a long time. My experience is most of us in Washington know everything, and most of what we know is wrong. We knew there was going to be a red wave, probably a tsunami, I can't even pronounce it. The Democrats were in disarray. It always seems like the Democrats are in disarray. And that they were just going to get rolled, and who knew where that was going to take us. And there were lots of surprises. And there's been lots of commentary. But there's been precious little commentary about the role of faith and the faithful. An example of that, the exit polls. I'm not an expert on this, some of you are, but I looked at the exit polls, and all you could find out is how white evangelicals voted and how the rest of us voted. So I think all 6 of us are in the other category. And how often people went to church and how they voted. And we know how rich and complex and confusing faith and the faithful are in politics. White evangelicals are the base of the Republican Party. Black Protestants may be the most religious group in our society, and they're the heart of the Democratic Party. E.J. Dionne has a great line. He says, there is no Catholic vote, and it's really important. Because they decide. And very often when we're talking about the Catholic vote, we're talking about the white Catholic vote, when in fact its most important, most decisive element might be Latinos. And we know that Jewish people tend to be allies of the Democratic Party. And then we have the nuns, and I'm not talking about the women who educated me, the people who, I think the second largest religious group in America are people who think they're ex-Catholics. That's an oxymoron. You're never really an ex-Catholic. But so it's really complicated. And so we thought, let's take this neglected area and let's find the smartest people we can to help us understand it. And so here we are. And so let me begin just with the simplest of questions before we get to religion. What happened in the midterms and why? Susan? Let me first introduce people. That would be useful. Susan is the senior writer, was a senior writer at the Washington Free Beacon. She's a political correspondent for Real Clear Politics. She worked for the Washington Examiner, The Hill, Congressional Quarterly, and Roll Call. She's a graduate of the University of Southern California. Bill Galston is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. 9 books. Some of them must be here. You've been writing books for so long. And you're a weekly columnist at the Wall Street Journal. He was a professor and acting dean at the University of Maryland. He worked in 6 presidential campaigns. Do not ask him how many won. He's a former Marine, and he has a PhD from Harvard. Jack Jenkins is University of Chicago. Sorry. Oh, God, that's terrible. Jack Jenkins is the national reporter for Religion News Service. He has written a book with the longest title of anyone on the panel, American Prophets, The Religious Roots of Progressive Politics and the Ongoing Fight for the Soul of the Country.
It was originally shorter.
Yeah. What focus group did you use? He was the religion reporter for Think Progress, and he's written for all sorts of things. He has a Master of Divinity from the University of Chicago. From the University of Harvard, and a BA from Presbyterian College. He was writing about Christian nationalism before everybody started talking about it. Sabrina Rodriguez was a Politico covering Latinos and Latinas and emerging groups in American politics. She's now at the Post. She got a degree at Northwestern. One thing I remember, I think you were at Politico, and you wrote a story. You went to Guatemala and to the border to actually talk to people who were immigrating and why they were coming and what they were afraid of, and it made a difference. The other thing I just noticed before she left Politico, she wrote a profile of Maxwell Frost, the 25-year-old Afro-Cuban who was the first Gen Zen in Congress. It's also reported on some of these Republican Latino women. And then Eugene Scott, as I said, was a fellow at the Institute of Politics here. He's a national reporter for the Washington Post, political reporter. He worked on The Fix, their daily blog. He was at CNN. Actually, he was born here in Washington. There are such people. He got his first job as a journalist, I think, in South Africa. He attended Harvard Kennedy School, but he did come to Georgetown to be a fellow. So that's our panel. Susan, what happened and why?
Wow, it's a big topic. I'm a generalist political reporter my whole life, covered the White House and Congress more than the White House for more than 25 years. So I will defer on a lot of the faith issues to other experts. But it was one of the stranger elections that we've all covered. Stranger still, as we're looking at that the Republicans actually won the popular vote by about 4 points, which is a flip of what happened in 2020. So you would think that would translate into at least a red puddle, a red trickle. But we are seeing, that the House is going Republican, but it is not by the same margins as a lot of pollsters expected. We, of course, at Real Clear Politics, we specialize in polls. I felt like there was a lot of big Senate races that were super close. And I've devoted my last week to looking at the early vote. And I truly believe that because we are in a post-pandemic situation with mail-in and early voting, that Republicans did not invest in that at all. In fact, their money dried up. If you look at a column by J.D. Vance recently, he went into this in great detail that they were drastically outspent. And there is this huge civil war going on in the Republican Party right now between McConnell and the NRSC, the campaign arm that elects Senate Republicans, about why they did not do a better job, specifically with the ground game and competing. I was on the ground in Nevada last week, and the Culinary Union was very aggressive in knocking more doors than they did in previous elections. They said they were going to knock on 1 million doors. And I feel like they made the difference there. It was a close race. You had Joe Lombardo, the governor, besting Adam Laxalt, the Republican. by a few percentage points, but going up against an incumbent takes a lot of money, and the Republicans just didn't devote the money to the ground game this year. Now, when you talk about what happened in terms of faith voters, completely different subject. I think that there was this big movement right after the Dobbs decision to talk about the Democrats were talking about abortion, and that was resonating in the public. And then there was a lot of prognosticators in Washington said, "Oh, that's dying down now. We don't have to worry about that. Republicans don't need to be so concerned." And I even wrote a story saying Republicans, including Marco Rubio, had found his footing on abortion because there were polls out showing that a lot of the American public really is in between on that issue. It's, a lot of exceptions. They support a lot of exceptions. And I think that's true even among the faith voters. At Real Clear Politics, we did some polling work with Catholic TV, EWTN, and we found that even among Catholic voters, they were supportive of keeping Roe v. Wade. They were not supportive of the Supreme Court, even though privately they didn't think that, if you looked at what they felt privately about personally what they would do in their own lives, they said they didn't support certain abortion exceptions, of course, but whether they were going to support overturning Roe v. Wade, they did not. It was complicated because they also did not support Joe Biden in saying he wanted to codify Roe v. Wade. So it's the American public is somewhere in between, but we found out that Catholic voters, by a significant number, even in states like Michigan, supported keeping access to abortion, and especially in Kentucky. Kentucky was a big surprise, I think, for both evangelicals and Catholic leaders, that the effort to deny access is supportive of. It was a GOP-backed amendment to their constitution, failed. Mm-hmm. So I think that was my takeaways mainly, that the Kentucky was a big surprise, just like Kansas.
That's a great overview. Jack, you were working with a piece of that.
Right.
What do you think happened?
I typically reject silver bullet narratives to describe big elections. It's usually, to Susan's point, 1,000 things at once. I think one of the big ones was, the frustration about the overturning of Roe had a longer tail than people expected. I think Democrats wished that this midterm had been held even a month or two earlier. I think they felt like they probably would have held the House if they had done that. And we can get into it later, but to your point, I think there's a lot of diversity of thought when it comes to abortion, even among faith voters, that people didn't expect. I think the other major issue that's been talked about a lot is Republicans had a candidate quality problem when it came to the Senate in particular, and there was a lot of dialogue around that. And the third one is that there was, seems to have been a general rejection, particularly at statewide races, of Trumpism, which has a myriad of different expressions. And one of those is Christian nationalism. And it's hard to see a firmer rejection of it than Doug Mastriano losing 14 points in Pennsylvania. And so I think those are three big pieces of a perfect storm that really ended up giving us a midterm election that looked, like to your point, weirder than they normally are. And I know we're going to get into more later, but those are the big takeaways I have.
That's really helpful. Eugene, you've done a lot of work about identity in politics. Help us understand the intersection between identity and the midterms.
Yes, one, there's been a lot of criticism of polls that I think is unfair. I think a lot of polls were solid, but people drew conclusions about them that just didn't apply. So perfect example would be a poll telling us what highly likely voters are going to do. That poll doesn't factor in first-time voters. It doesn't factor in sporadic voters. I remember seeing a tweet from a young man in Texas saying he went to vote for Beto and he hadn't voted since 2008. Like that, people like that don't get captured in these polls. A highly likely voter poll consists of people who are incredibly partisan, much more educated, higher income. So, I mean, you're leaving out a lot of people, especially in Arizona, where I used to cover politics at the local level, where the majority of voters are independent, right? And so they're not highly partisan, and you're not getting information about from lower income and middle income voters. And so I think we keep polling. We just need to tell people what this poll says and not make people believe that it says anything other than it does. I mean, we know Gen Z had a crazy impact, but Gen Z, like the millennials before them, don't answer calls from strangers, and they don't click on text links in text telling them what they're going to do. But there's one factor I think also influenced things. Susan was talking about Nevada earlier. The Bulwark had a great piece. In addition to Republicans not being very proactive when it comes to mail-in voting, there's not been as much conversation about just how many voters have died since COVID. And in one of their pieces, the Bulwark said Republicans accounted for about 80% more of the excess COVID deaths than Democrats. To take just one example, between January 2021 and this month, 9,400 people in Nevada died of COVID. And so, I mean, you add that up nationally. I mean, this is tens of thousands of voters who died. And many of these voters tended to be older, tended to be white, tended to be more conservative. Not all. And so the pandemic caused a lot of Republican candidates to lose voters. So that was one thing.
And that's a big problem in Nevada, but maybe not in Chicago.
Probably not in Chicago.
Well, Mo Udall said at one point when he was very sick that when he died, he wanted to be buried in Chicago because he wanted to remain active in political life. Bill.
Mo Udall stories with you, but I'll restrain myself. But one of Udall's favorites was his explanation to a freshman congressman as to why the debate was going on so long when new points had ceased being made an hour ago. And he famously said, "You don't understand. Everything has been said, but not everybody has said it." And that's what I feel like right now. I wish you'd started at this end. But I would, putting my political scientist hat on for just a minute, the traditional political science maxim is that midterm elections, particularly the first election after a president has taken office, those elections are a referendum on the incumbent. I'm sure all of you have heard this. And I'll say this, if this election had been a referendum on the incumbent, we'd be talking about a very different outcome. I see this election as a triple referendum. A referendum on Joe Biden, which he did not win, a referendum on the Supreme Court, which the Supreme Court lost miserably, and a referendum on former President Trump, which he and his acolytes lost even worse than the Supreme Court did. And so you had a kind of a triple rejection going on in this election, not an enormous amount of affirmation, but the American people were saying no not only to results that they didn't like inflation, they were also saying no to positions they didn't like extreme positions on social issues. And they were also saying no to a style of politics that they had grown very weary of. And I'd say the test case for that came with Kari Lake in Nevada, who was Trump in high heels. And she was, as everybody was saying at the time, she was stylistically a terrific candidate. She'd spent 30 years behind, in front of the camera. And every line she delivered was perfectly paced to land. But the things that she was saying were out of sync with the middle of the electorate in Arizona. And I know a lot of people have said this, but I'll conclude on this note. For those of us who believe that the salvation of American politics lies in the middle of the electorate, this election was great news because in my book, the electorate rose up and said, no more, no mouse. We've had enough. Could we have a little bit of civility and common sense? And I'm glad that quieter candidates carried the day.
Sabrina, we've been talking about how religion did not get much attention. Latino voters, including Latino Catholics, evangelicals, and nuns, got a lot of attention, but a lot of it seemed pretty superficial. People diving in, right before, right after election. You've been reporting and analyzing this community for a long time. What happened?
That's still the million-dollar question, I will say. I always add the caveat in the days after the election that exit polls that's a very early picture of what has happened, and a lot of the analysts will tell you, okay, wait for precinct level data and state specific data. I'm sure, if you've been following the results, there's been lots of talk of what happened in Florida, for example, and Ron DeSantis and Marco Rubio having huge wins, Republicans having huge wins in Florida. They won the majority of the Latino vote. In Miami-Dade County, a county that voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016 by more than 30 points. This time, Ron DeSantis won by about 10 points. So, it's a massive shift that we're seeing in a state like that. But then when you go to Nevada and you're looking at, Catherine Cortez Masto's race, and she's the first Latina in the Senate, she won a majority of Latinos. She won something in the 60%, 65%, depending on what polling you're looking at. And there had been a whole question there of, are we going to see, Republicans make gains with Latinos? The fact is, though, that the picture that we have right now, while there may be some tweaks in data and getting more information as the weeks come, does show us that two things can be true at the same time. Democrats can have won Latino voters, and Republicans could have made gains with Latino voters. And I think, depending on who you talk to in the punditry, will pick one side of that story and really lean into it and tell you, oh, well, yes, because Republicans, it's a realignment. And then Democrats will tell you, but we won 60%, or we still have the majority. Again, those two things can be true. And Republicans don't need to be winning a majority of Latinos to make a huge dent in races across the country. By just changing margins of 2-3%, that can really determine races across the country. And we have seen it in certain places happening. One of the places that everyone was going to be looking at as ground zero of what was happening was South Texas. So 3 Republican Latina candidates who really leaned into their faith in their races. That 2 out of the 3 lost, and there had been millions of dollars in investments. Republican leaders had been bringing them to Washington to, tout, look at the diversity of our candidates and these women that are really fighting to win. But ultimately, they lost by several percentage points. So there's a lot that you can go through it because it shows that they did resonate. The fact that they reached this national, got this national attention, the fact that they ran competitive races in places that have been just historic, huge Democratic strongholds shows us that this isn't over. The whole narrative of, are Republicans making gains with Latinos, that's not going anywhere. But I think it'll just be interesting to see how that evolves with the data that we get in the coming days.
It was really interesting here. Republicans underinvested in the ground game, and Catholics were sort of confusing. Christian nationalism sort of fell flat. Dead people don't vote in Nevada. The center roared, and Latinos are complicated. That's really a good way to describe a very complicated thing. Let's turn to religion and pick one of these. Evangelicals, Catholics, black voters, Latino voters, or pick a party, Democrats or Republicans. What was going on in the interaction between religious communities, religious voters, and the two parties? What were they trying to do? What were its impacts? What could we learn? Susan started us out by talking about what happened to Catholics. Why don't we begin with Eugene?
Well, I'll do black voters. And we know that black voters overwhelmingly vote Democratic. And one of the things that's important that you noted, there's such significant overlap between black voters and black Protestants. They're pretty much interchangeable. And one thing I think people do not discuss often when talking about black voters, that they do when talking about white evangelicals, is that most black voters vote for the Democratic Party from a place of religious conviction. In terms of their values, their beliefs on what the gospel teaches in terms of how it is you are supposed to treat your fellow man, they feel is most aligned with what they see in the Democratic Party. And the best example of that race is if you look at the support for Senator Raphael Warnock, whose faith is so intertwined with his politics, and he speaks about this very often. And as you know, Georgia's headed to a runoff, which Sabrina knows more than any of us. And so I think what you are going to see and should be paying attention to moving forward with black voters that we saw a bit of in this midterm is even if black voters are not completely supportive of the Democratic Party, they will be continuing to vote against Christian nationalism because of the historic relationship between Christian nationalism and white supremacy, which people don't talk about as much as they should. But to many black voters, Christian nationalism is a fundamentally anti-black and racist worldview. And so any type of candidate that moves forward with that, whenever black voters hear a lawmaker stand up and say that America is a Christian nation that should be shaping policy based on the Bible, the antennas go up and fear goes up, especially considering how many black voters, like my parents, who are still alive, were alive during the Civil Rights Movement, and these dog whistles are like full-on horns.
Let me turn to you, Jack, and let's continue that conversation. You have done more work than anybody I know on trying to understand Christian nationalism, what it is, what its roots are, where it's showing up, and what its impact is. Share with us, what have you found, and how did it play out?
Well, I think this election was really interesting that way, in that if there's a lesson, I was joking about this with a friend, it's like, don't go full Christian nationalist, right? Like the candidates who own themselves as a Christian nationalist, with one exception, didn't do very well compared to those who might have courted Christian nationalists as a constituency. You know, one of the interesting narratives of Doug Mastriano, who, you know, he became famous in the state of Pennsylvania by participating in this movement that fused Christian nationalism with protesting lockdown measures connected to the pandemic or anti-vaccine or anti-mask sentiment. And it was this very particular movement that was kind of an outgrowth of things that we saw on January 6th, you know, people with shofars who had very specific, often evangelical expressions of faith. And then when he, you know, when it came down for the primary, that group we've seen in the past is one of the most politically active groups in the country. Pew did a survey earlier this year where they broke down the country in about 9 different subsets. And the most conservative one was what they called faith and flag conservatives. And they said on the record to reporters later that that was their attempt to kind of quantify Christian nationalism as a political group. And when they tried to assess the political activity of these different groups, they saw that this group, you know, was always tied with on the other end of the spectrum, progressives, with, you know, how often you're going to talk about voting, how often you're going to vote, how often you're going to go to a rally, how often you talk about politics at home, right? And while they only make up around 9% of the public, they make up around a quarter of the Republican Party. And if we're talking about a group that votes outsized compared to other groups, that means they're going to make up a large constituency in a primary in particular. So that's how you end up with a person like Doug Mastriano. It turns out, though, when you have a statewide race, you know, that constituency of Christian nationalists isn't enough to catapult that person into victory. I mean, losing by 14 points is a lot. And I think that was a really prime example of that. Similarly, I mean, I think it's really interesting that Lauren Boebert, who expressed a similar version of Christian nationalism that Doug Mastriano did. And I should note, Doug Mastriano rejects the term Christian nationalist, but still expresses forms of Christian nationalism. Lauren Boebert, it looks like she will probably hold on to her seat, but just barely. And that is a really interesting development, given that the last few months have been, she's gotten her biggest moments in the sun, the most press attention that she's gotten, have been her doing things like saying that she thinks that the separation of church and state should not exist or does not exist, right? This classic maxim of Christian nationalism. And then you had the instance of Kari Lake, who played a little bit differently. She was more Trumpian in that she appealed to Christian nationalists as opposed to owning it and wearing it on her sleeve. And that didn't prove super successful either. So I think there's going to be an interesting conversation within conservative circles after this election, where the people who are diehard Christian nationalists aren't going anywhere. They very much believe this. I mean, there are people who are walking around where they're counting votes in Arizona right now, again, blowing shofars. That sounds familiar. They're probably going to, stay on that train for as long as they can. But whether the party leans into it, whether we see candidates really decide that that's a winning strategy, I think this election changed in a big way.
Thank you for that. Sabrina, can you dig a little deeper for us? First of all, who you are the expert on the panel on Georgia, so who's going to win? And after that, if you would, how does religion, faith, Catholic identity, evangelical identity, non-identity play out in the Latino communities? First of all, Anglos speak of the Latino community in a way that distorts everything. Help us understand a little bit about the diversity, complexity, and how does religion shape that?
So I'll first say,
First of all, Georgia.
Georgia, although I will not tell you who's going to win. If I had the answer to that, guys, I would not be a journalist. I would be making lots and lots of money as like a big consultant. But no, I mean, Georgia actually, when we're talking about faith, has played such a huge role in both races. We see it, and obviously, like Eugene was mentioning, with Warnock being a pastor and being at Ebenezer and kind of the tradition of that church, and really he embodies that. I mean, on the campaign trail and hearing his speeches and such, it's clear. But Herschel Walker on the other side, on the Republican side, has also really leaned into his faith. And it shows kind of the calculus here of, white evangelicals and him trying to lean in to really build out that support, secure that support. And, Warnock in the tradition of his church and such, I mean, looking for that support securing that support from the Black church, energizing people to go out and vote. For right now, for the runoff election, I'm thinking about a lot of who do you energize? Because in a runoff election, people are burnt out. People had to vote in 2020, then they had a runoff in 2021, now they had a midterm, and you're asking them to go vote again? And in such a quick turnaround, the runoff this year is on December 6th. So right now it's okay, we need to energize our bases. And who are the bases for the two? We're seeing it for Democrats, ensuring that Black voters go out and vote again. And Walker, there's been lots of talk and lots of stories that have come out, obviously, about his abortion views and the former girlfriends that came out and made the allegations that he paid for them to get abortions. But I think something really interesting of being on the ground and talking to people about it and his supporters was them saying, well, he's redeemed himself and, his redemption arc and, everyone has secrets and everyone has things that have happened in the past but the alternative is someone that does support abortion rights. So if he's going to vote for an abortion ban and he's against abortion, well, if I have to pick between the two, I'll pick him. So I think it's really interesting, too, to just be on the ground and get to talk to people about their complicated or not so complicated views on all these issues. And then I'll jump to, and again, like I said, it's going to be a tight race. So I think anyone that tries to tell you right now that, Democrats have it on lock or Republicans have it on lock does not know that for a fact. But with Latino voters, I mean, for me, what's interesting is all the states that there are a growing population in. And I will bring it back to Georgia again. Right now, for example, we're seeing, 10% of the state population in Georgia is Latino voters. When we talk about them, we often talk about California, Arizona, Nevada, Texas, Florida, because obviously they make up a huge percentage of the electorate there. But it's in these states that are battleground swing states where, in the Senate race, for example, Warnock didn't hit the 50%, but he was ahead of Walker by 35,000 votes. If 35,000 more Latino voters had gone out to vote, Walker would be ahead. So when we're talking about Latino voters, I always try to bring that home where it's all these states where there's small margins. Right now, for example, in Georgia, there's a sizable Latino evangelical population. And like I said, I going to Walker events, I'm talking to white evangelicals often that are going to these rallies. But now, for example, I'm actually heading back to Georgia tomorrow morning. And one of the things that's on my list is there's a bunch of different groups. Ralph Reed's Faith and Freedom Coalition, for example, is focusing on investing specifically on Hispanic evangelicals in the coming weeks, because they know there's enough of them that if they get them excited to go out and vote and pitch them on, okay, this is your responsibility, go vote, this is the man that's going to represent your values, that can shift the election. That can help them ultimately at the finish line. But I think, again, we talk often about, white evangelicals specifically. There's a growing Latino evangelical population across the country that is making a difference in these races, no question.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between evangelical Latino voters and Catholic Latino voters?
Yes. So one of the most striking data points for me this year was the Washington Post did right before the election a comprehensive poll with Hispanic voters specifically. And it was, which direction are you going to vote? Are you going to support Democrats, Republicans? How do you feel about the Dobbs decision? Some of the general points that we've looked at. And we saw consistently, everyone was on the same page about what the top issues are, abortion being a top issue, inflation being a top issue, rising prices, crime, immigration. The top, what you would define as the issues are the issues that we all care about in the U.S. We're all aware of what's going on with inflation. We're all aware of what's going on with abortion. But what was striking to me was, seeing evangelical voters, evangelical Hispanics, were overwhelmingly going to support Republican candidates. Catholic voters were going to, a majority were going to support Democratic candidates. And I think it trends with what we see outside of the Latino community. Oftentimes we try to separate it out, but a lot of these things are more complicated than that, where it's not just a Latino, but a Latino and how does their faith impact it.
Susan, Real Clear Politics is one of the places that takes religion seriously in terms of politics. Be interested, and you cover the Congress, you particularly know a lot about Republicans. How do you think Republicans are thinking about faith and politics? Or take us where your data leads us, but it seems clear that both parties are trying to figure out how to appeal to different constituencies, and one of the things they're looking at is people's faith.
Yes. I thought this was really interesting in terms of what happened with Joe Biden and how he really tried to appeal to evangelical voters. During his convention, he even was always talking about that this was a contest for the soul of the nation. And he is the second Catholic president, but the only one who does support abortion. So here we have had Donald Trump, who had such an amazing support among evangelicals, but he's sort of the least religious practicing individual that we've had in political office in the White House for a long time. But here you have Biden, who carries a rosary as a reminder of his son's death, who attends regularly, and he actually did do better on the margins with evangelicals and with Catholic voters than Hillary Clinton did. It was by about, if I can recall, about 4 percentage points. But right in this midterm election, you did not have Donald Trump out there rallying evangelicals. You had a referendum, but we talked about it. We thought maybe it would be a referendum on Joe Biden's policies or Joe Biden's approval rating, which was at 43, 44%. But that's not what really happened. It seemed like people they're not so angry at Joe Biden. And so you had more issues-based voters, and you had the turnout problem, as I mentioned. But yeah, I thought that this particular midterm, if you really look at the AP does this VoteCast, so they have exit polls. If you look at that data, we're starting to see some things coming out. Catholic voters, actually, from our polling, John Della Volpe did a lot of our polling on the Catholic voters, and it's very difficult to typecast them because you're talking about a fifth of the electorate, so it's a very swing group, but you're talking about people who go to Mass every Sunday, once a month, all the way down to people who don't go at all but still consider themselves Catholic. So if you talk about the people if you look at just the people who go once a month, you'll have a lot more anti-abortion views, you'll have a lot more concern about transgender issues, CRT in classrooms, things that you would see, and they are more aligned with the Republican Party. But it's about a 40-60, or it's almost even in some of the polling that we did between the party identity for this whole Catholic group that identifies as Catholic. So again, the thing that I thought most compelling out of all of that was that they still they did not support the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision by a large margin. It wasn't even, and if you saw in Michigan, in that amendment to allow abortion access, or 60% of Catholics supported that. So that's kind of interesting. And the evangelicals did not. But even when you look at Catholics and evangelicals, you have, I think 1 out of 10 Americans believe there should be abortions, no restriction, they believe that abortion should be outlawed in all cases. Only 1 out of 10. When we talk about evangelicals, it's a 2 out of 10. So you have a lot of variety even among evangelicals on exceptions for abortion, and we saw that playing out.
Mm-hmm. It seems interesting that, and I'm going to turn to Bill on this, but what was on display was the extremism of one side, bans, and at least in some elements of the Democratic Party, no restrictions at all, which at least some of us consider extreme, that the ban extremism seemed to be more unpopular than the other. Bill, you've been dealing with values, religious voters within the Democratic Party, how to handle difficult moral issues about abortion, about identity, about pluralism. How does your party reach out to religious voters? How did they do here, and what do you think the implications are?
Well, in most elections, to be frank, Democrats do not do a very good job of reaching out in an organized way to religious voters. So much so that journalists write about the exceptions in very interesting ways. As you probably know, the Democratic Party overwhelmingly has become the party of the nones. And furthermore, highly educated professionals, mostly, though not entirely white, are a driving force in the Democratic Party in setting the agenda. And they tend not to be very much aware of religion or the importance of religion for people who are not like them. Unfortunately, Democrats are usually a little bit tone deaf when it comes to people of faith. The dominant outlook, I would say, is secular. And this is true even of people who are themselves believers, who attend the religious house of their choice on a pretty regular basis. I know, for example, that many Jews, of whom I'm one, who attend synagogue regularly, who are pillars of their community, are still inclined to take a predominantly secular outlook, when it comes to public policy. And so, what I see, unfortunately, is one party with a predominantly secular outlook, with the exception of the African American base, which is a huge exception. And by the way, there's a palpable tension between upscale white progressives on the one hand, and members of the African American community on a number of sort of moral, religious, and cultural issues, where African Americans are really moderate in many cases, and at least as I read them, but I'll defer to you on that. And the other major portion of the party, upscale white professionals, are not. So Democrats tend to do okay on the cultural issues when the other side goes too far, as happened in this case. I say this with regret, because I think the Democratic Party would be a stronger party, and the United States would be a stronger country if you had two political parties who understood both faith and our constitutional tradition of church-state separation. So right now, you have a party that understands a lot about faith, but is, I'd say, decreasingly inclined to maintain the church-state separation. That's the Republican Party. And on the other hand, you have a Democratic Party that understands the value of church-state separation, but doesn't really have a good feel for the sentiments of believers. I think that split is not useful.
Eugene, you want to comment on the tension that Bill identified?
There are two things that come to mind. So my assumption from what I gather is many Democratic leaders believe that white evangelicals just aren't winnable and have almost written them off, which is not a fair assumption to make everywhere, right? One of the things about this country is, and that I wish more people understood, is that, different candidates and different strategies would be successful in different places. There are people, there's no way Herschel Walker would have made it to a runoff in almost anywhere but the Bible Belt. Because he just would not have been attractive to maybe like the GOP in New Hampshire or whatnot. And so I think one of the issues that Democrats feel like we can't win these white evangelicals anyway. And what's also true in terms of ignorance about white evangelicals within the Democratic Party, what it means to be going back to Michael Gerson, white evangelical in 2022 is something very different than 2012. And so even if you try to understand this community, it's changed so much. And I think some of the best writing or analysis about white evangelicals right now suggests looking at it more as a political movement than a religious community. We've seen the number of people identifying as white evangelical tick up in the Trump years. And if you align that with what they believe from a doctrinal level, you're like, this is not evangelicalism or Christianity at all. But and secondly, I was going to say one worldview, we can't call it religious, but worldview that I think the Democratic Party is doing really well with and probably going to continue to make gains with is the nones, the religiously unaffiliated. Gen Z is the most religiously unaffiliated age group that exists. Before that, it was millennials. One of the things I think a lot of people who are outside of the nones, who are more religiously conservative, they interpret nones as having like no values. And that's not what it means. This is a deeply principled group of young people. They just don't find their roots centered in religion. And I think the more extreme the GOP goes when it comes to religion, the more the Democrats are going to be able to appeal to those.
One of the things I heard you say was every voter is a values voter. The question is, what are the values? It's time for questions. So there are a number of young people, Georgetown students. I particularly would encourage them to go forward. But people my age are smart too. So we welcome all comers. So hands, who wants to ask a question? If you don't, I'm going to keep asking them. Over here, if we could get the mic. You got to stand up and talk clearly because we got 1,000 people behind that camera.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks very much for the panel. So John started us off by observing that the religious vote really didn't get any attention except for white evangelical Christians and maybe to some extent Christian nationalists. But that's, I think, from my perspective anyway, part of a broader phenomenon. It seems to me that, at least for a long time, in the mind of the press, religious means white, very conservative, maybe crazy conservative religious. And so I'd like to ask the panel from their point of view as members of the media if they have any explanation for that or what their take on that is.
Jack, you cover the full spectrum of religious expression and political life. Less about the press, more about the country.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, Nancy Pelosi announced that she's no longer going to run for party leader the next go round today. She referenced scripture in that speech. She talked about the spark of divinity in other people in that speech. And she talked about St. Francis in that speech. See how often any of that comes up in the coverage of that speech today. And that is she does, and that wasn't special to that speech. She talks that way all the time. And it's an interesting thing as a religion reporter because that's a common refrain when covering Democrats in particular, where they actually do talk about faith a lot. In fact, you were talking about outreach to faith voters. One of the most robust faith outreach campaigns of any presidential campaign in modern history was Obama's 2008 campaign. And Joe Biden dedicated an entire section of the Democratic National Convention in 2020 to discussing his faith and faith in general. And again, it kind of leans into that fact that back in the 1990s and 1980s, what was then referred to as the religious right was very successful in claiming the idea of religion in the public sphere as something that belongs to them and that specific demographic. It's been interesting seeing how that's developed over time, though, right? Like we're talking about abortion today as this religious concern, this religious idea, and it's certainly true that there are any number of traditions and the Catholic Church and also any number of Protestant traditions that teach opposition to abortion. But when you look at polling, we see that Hispanic and Latino Catholics actually increased from 51% saying they wanted abortion to be legal in all or most cases to 75% over the course of 12 years from 2010 to 22. We saw similar increases among Black Protestants as well as white mainliners, white Catholics as well. We're really only talking about a couple of major religious groups that actually take the opposite view, and that's white evangelicals and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I think it really comes down to our political discourse where, when people don't hear the religious references when a Democrat makes it, or when, as happened in the last few months after Dobbs was overturned, if you went to a lot of those rallies, those abortion rights rallies, usually the second, third, or sometimes first person to speak was somebody representing a faith group saying, oh, we support abortion rights. They don't necessarily get a lot of attention, although they have in the last 2 or 3 months. And so I think it has a lot to do with that discourse that happened back in the 80s and 90s. The other piece I would add to that is that covering the religious left, for lack of a better term, is actually really hard. It's a lot of different faith groups at once. It's a lot of organizations that only exist maybe for a couple of years and then fold, and another one pops up. Whereas you cover the religious right, I can call Ralph Reed, right? You can call a number of different faith groups. It's gotten a little complicated since Trump ascended because he brought a whole other group of people with him. But it's harder for reporters to keep track of just one religion, much less the myriad of different expressions that show up in the left these days.
You raised a very interesting point when you talked about Pelosi's speech today. You made a prediction about the coverage of that speech. And that really is, I think, the point of the question, right? Is there something about the elite press corps, the sociology of the elite press corps, that would not tend to sensitize them to that kind of language and see its importance in political life? I would bet sight unseen that most of the people hired by the Washington Post, the New York Times, and publications of that ilk are graduates of excellent coastal universities and are likely not to have a particularly deep religious outlook. I could be wrong about that, but I've read pieces on the sociology of the press that suggest that unlike 2 generations ago, when a lot of members of the press were working stiffs and were about as religious as the country as a whole, whatever that may be, that has changed dramatically as hiring patterns have changed.
Another question. I stayed up and tried to watch the Trump announcement as much as they broadcast it, and it was just the opposite. What struck me was there was no mention of God, religion, or abortion. No taking credit for the Supreme Court. So, sort of fascinating. Other questions? We got a bunch over here. This is Christian, our new colleague. You need to learn to run to the people with.
I wanted to ask about.
Stand up.
I wanted to ask a little bit about how the abortion vote, specifically in states like Kentucky, also the vote during the summer in Kansas, whether it was Michigan, Kansas, Kentucky, or even funkier states like Alaska or Montana. It was just not popular. Abortion bans in general were not popular across the country, and that was something people weren't expecting. And I think my question is, what can Republicans learn, not only about their messaging, but also about their future policies when it comes to abortion, because this election proved that their messaging thus far was not popular?
Let's collect a few questions, and then we'll ask the panel. Chris is back there, and then there's a young woman in the middle here.
You guys are great. I'm really very interested. It occurs to me that few people would argue that we're not very calcified and we're not really talking much to each other. And it's very, very tough to really penetrate or persuade the other side. And it's also pretty clear from listening to you guys how complicated it is and how close these various races are. So if I were a Democratic or Republican strategist and I'm looking at different groups to move the needle so that I can win in 2024, would faith be a real fat target for me given the complications and the crosswinds, or would I go elsewhere to move the needle in terms of, I mean, there's maybe 5, 7, 8% of the people that you can reach at this point, I'm afraid. So,
young woman here.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. So throughout the dialogue, there's been a lot of conversation about the major faith groups in the United States. And I was wondering about how minority faith groups like Jews, Hindus, Muslims, and other faith groups like Buddhists all factor into the vote also, like how their demographics factor into it. Do they vote more along other demographic lines or along their actual religion?
There was one over here, young woman, and then we'll ask the panel to pick and choose.
Thank you so much. I had a similar question. I'm a member of Gen Z. I consider myself progressive, but I'm also very religious. I'm Muslim. So I was wondering about the Muslim vote, but I was also wondering about the religious left, like you touched on in the last question, and just in general, the role of religious younger voters in this election, and if that tends to fall in line with older religious voters or differs.
So we have younger religious voters, minority religions, other religious voices. Is it worth pursuing people of faith? And it's not complete without an abortion question. So, and I would add a last one, and you can choose any or all of these. What's this mean for 2 years from now for a presidential race? So, other religious voices, abortion again, is it worth pursuing people of faith, and what's it mean for the future? Who wants to jump in? Sabrina?
I'll jump in with, is it worth it? I absolutely, one of the things, so I'm from Miami, I'm from Florida, I've been paying attention a lot to the results there, and this doesn't just apply to voters of faith, but one of the reasons that Democrats did so poorly was because they didn't show up. There's consistently hearing in the state that nobody ever knocked on their door, nobody ever sent mail to them, nobody did outreach, there were barely any events, there was just barely any visibility because they felt like they were going to lose the election before they lost it. I think that is an issue that the Democratic Party has right now. I'm not going to say it to the whole country, but in Florida specifically, I can speak to that. And I've been thinking a lot in the past few days, like, this is not a short term, this is the long game for these parties. So I think it absolutely is worth it to be reaching out to voters of faith, to making that calculus. If you're going to make investments on trying to court white suburban women, why wouldn't you make investments to try and court Latino evangelicals, even if you can only peel off a few people, or even if this is just a conversation that you're going to start to hopefully reap political benefits from 10 years from now. I think it's just a calculation that the parties both need to be making. I think that, when someone said this to me for a story that I did specifically out of Florida, that she was saying, when Republicans lose, they double down on investing to do better. When Democrats lose, they walk away. And that's what we saw in Florida. And I think for the long-term games in these parties, there's no question that there needs to be an investment in ground game and outreach and targeting these specific groups that make a difference in these elections.
Pick one or a final comment.
Just real quick on two of the questions. I do know that Muslim American candidates did better this year than they did last cycle. They got 80, I believe, candidates. Muslim American candidates won their races compared to 71 the last go-round. And obviously in Michigan in particular, the Muslim vote, where there is a large population, is courted every year. In fact, one of the first presidential candidates to court the Muslim vote in Michigan was George W. Bush. And things have changed since then. But I think one of the things that has gotten a lot of attention in the last 4 or 5 years is that vote is not a lock. It is not a monolith, which I think is true among a lot of these different groups. But one of the things that gets unsaid up here is part of the reason that we talk about the major faith groups is because those are the ones that show up in polls, because polling is very expensive and it costs a lot of money to poll smaller groups. And so the truth is a lot of it comes through reporting. So younger people of faith do show up, do vote. There's some evidence that they vote in higher numbers than those who are not of faith. But beyond that, there needs to be more research, there needs to be more data. So if you have any, please send it our way, because I think this is something that my colleagues at Religion News Service and I talk about a lot. One of my colleagues, Alejandra Molina, has done a lot of work in this, and we often bemoan that there isn't enough data on some of these smaller faith groups to get a good gauge about how they will vote or what's driving them to the polls each go round.
If you're not following Religion News Service, you're really missing something. It's just remarkable, the quality. Susan, you have helped us already understand some of the dynamics on abortion and how it played out. Pick one of those questions, or what's it mean for the future, you think?
Well, on one of the issues I thought was conflicting and strange, and these strategists have to specialize in the state, because you make a lot of sweeping statements about evangelicals in the South that might be true, but there are these mega churches out in California, where I'm from, that aren't as political Okay, you would ask the majority of their congregations, and they would say, "Oh, I don't really want to talk about politics at church." So it's very like for instance, another conflicting, strange thing about this election on the abortion issue would be that some of the governors that supported pro-life or anti-abortion laws and signed them into law in the last 6 months they won comfortably. Ron DeSantis, Greg Abbott in Texas, DeWine in Ohio. So that was something that, it's not true. You have to pick your states and decide what's the most important thing in that state as a strategist and go after whether you're going to, for certainly like somebody like Tim Scott on the ticket would be a really big deal for someone like Donald Trump or even Ron DeSantis. He wears his faith on his sleeve. Also as a black evangelical, he would be able to reach across that divide. Maybe not.
Enough, right?
Maybe
Everything's
not.
about margins. Yeah.
But certainly he would be able to appeal to South Carolina and the South in that capacity. So I don't think we can make sweeping statements about across the whole country about Latinas, about evangelicals, and Catholics are very diverse. But faith in public life, as you saw with Nancy Pelosi, and we saw in the polling that we did, it motivates a lot of their personal behaviors, ethics. It gives you a personal sense of ethics. So I don't think as reporters we should be discounting that. We do have to factor in that the nuns are rising in this country. We're becoming a more secular society. The Gallup polls show that 4 out of 10 voters go to church or synagogue or mosque once a month. The rest do not. So we have to realize that as political reporters, the faith in public life is diminishing. Is that to the better of our society or not? Certainly with that speech from Nancy Pelosi today, we see that she has great value, that she can infuse her speeches with her belief system.
Eugene, we want to continue that? Worth reaching?
Yeah, it's definitely worth reaching. I just think that's trying to connect with people through the lens of religion is going to be less successful. If you talk about values, talk about what people believe it's right and wrong and just, you're going to be able to connect with people. And you just have to realize that for many voters, their values have been formed outside of an organized religion. I was going to say regarding the abortion issue, one thing that I think Republicans are going to have to be careful about is I think because of conservative media and some conservative polling that maybe some religious right organizations put out, there is an overestimate of how many people in this country think and view the world the way that they do. The bubble of the religious right, I think it's very real. And that's how you have, with all due respect, Lindsey Graham coming out for a national abortion ban in September, a few weeks before the election, after everything that happened this summer, and initially, I believe, with like no exceptions, or it wasn't really clear. And that happens when you believe that more people think the way you do than actually do. And that happens when you believe more people think the way you do. And it also happens, to Sabrina's point, when you're really just focused on turning out your base and not really trying to win new people. The problem is the base in 2022 isn't what it was in 2012 when it comes to conservative evangelicals. And lastly, to the question about young religious Gen Z, one of the things I'm always fascinated by with identity that I wish we talked about more is that all of us have like multiple identity groups, right? You're not just a white evangelical, you're also a woman, you're also a college educator, and all that stuff gets put into some algorithm, and how it comes out in the polls varies per person. And it could vary per election as well. Had abortion not been the issue this election that it was, maybe there would have been a red wave.
Well, what's this mean for a presidential election?
As they say in your nation's capital? Thank you for asking. Just a couple of random comments on the way to answering the gentleman in the back's question, which is the one I will choose. I would say, Gene, that there are lots of different bubbles in America these days, and you named one, but the bubble in which most highly educated professional nuns live is just as impermeable to other ways of life, unfortunately. And so popping these bubbles would be a wonderful thing for American politics, American society, and for all of us. If we've learned one thing from this election that we should never have forgotten in the first place, it is that the idea of America as polarized and as American voters as impervious to argument and persuasion and simply there to be mobilized by reaching out to the passions or the beliefs you think they have, that picture of the American electorate is wrong. There are a lot of people like that, but the people who aren't like that hold the balance of power in our society. And political operatives frequently forget that or say that it's cheaper and easier to mobilize people whose views are known than to reach out to people whose views may be less easy to categorize. So that's the first point I'd make. Secondly, having been in 6 presidential campaigns, it's one of the few questions on which I can opine with some experiential authority. And I can tell you for sure that it's not the little things you do. It's the big things that you stand for. The things that you stand for to all religious groups, and not just to one, and to people of no faith at all. The things that define you as a politician and a human being. The message that you're sending to the country as a whole is the one that will determine the outcome of the race. The old days, when you could say one thing to one group and another thing to another group and expect that somehow there would be no communication, there would be no publicity, no one would know that you'd made competing promises to 2 different groups, forget about that. That's not the world we live in anymore. And so you really have to be clear in your mind about what you stand for talking to the country as a whole. And if you get that right, then your chances are pretty good. What does it mean to get that right? This is the third and final point I'll make. To get that right means to understand that there is a vast, exhausted middle of American politics these days. On just about every issue you can name, there is a position that is supported by the majority, but they rarely hear it articulated by politicians of one party or the other. I could go down the list. Immigration is perhaps the best example. There is an American majority in favor of balanced immigration reform. If one party is talking about the functional equivalent of open borders and the other party is talking about deporting 11 million people, we're never going to get anywhere. So that's the way I'd begin to answer your question.
Thank you. A wonderful conclusion, which I'm going to skip, because for those of you gathered here, we have a terrific reception out there to continue the conversation. For those of you who are watching a screen, if you're in Washington, you're going to miss something wonderful. You're going to miss sliders and crab cakes and veggies, and I think there's some hummus out there. I don't know that. And you ought to be here next time. And if we had a wonderful discussion last night just for Latino leaders, young Latino leaders, about Latinos. Is going to be on our website in the next day or two. You can look for a lot of things like this. We are really going to work hard to continue to communicate. We have reached 200,000 people on the web since COVID. But we need to be together. We need to support each other. We need to talk to each other. We need to talk to people we disagree. So we're going to do both things. And tonight has just been a terrific example of that. I want to thank Kim Daniels. I want to thank Christian. And I want to thank Anna, who did the work to make this happen. But I especially want to thank these wonderful people who have shared their wisdom and their insight with us. So thank you very much. We'll see you in the President's Room, and we'll see you the next time we gather for another wonderful discussion.